Okay, so I said we're going to spend a little bit of time with gradients. And let's look at those first. So, they do have a handful of default gradients, just like they have a whole bunch of swatches in here, 216 to be precise. Notice these gradients down here. We have a linear gradient, goes from white to black, and we have a radial gradient, red to black, and green to black, and blue to black, and a multicolored one here. These are your gradient swatches. They can be applied to a fill. So if I select the oval tool, for example, and I select the fill bucket, so I'm going to select the fill color, and you'll see that I have the same options down here as well. Let's select the red gradient. And I want to constrain the proportions. Why? Just because I need to make a nice little ball circle. And when I release, I have applied a gradient for this. Now, if I wish to move the center of the gradient, notice that the gradient goes from exactly the center of the object outward. If I want to change the position of that, I can do so by selecting the fill bucket. And with the fill bucket, select and the gradient selected, all I have to do is click, and notice that wherever I click, it changes the center of the gradient. So if I want this to look more like a sphere, and I have a light source coming from the upper left-hand corner, notice that this looks a little bit more rounded now, as opposed from being by default center outward. We can also look at colors. I'm going to try and look at gradients. So let me go to window, and I want to look at, we call it there. Let's have color. Shows that it's a radial gradient. That's all I need is the color palette visible. So let me close it again. Let's open it back up. With the gradient selected, notice in my color palette that, again, it lets me know that I have the fill color selected here by clicking this tab. If I wanted to change the stroke color, I would click on that tab. You can only put a gradient in the fill, you can't put it in the stroke. So make sure that the gradient is selected. And you'll notice that with the black to gray gradient, it knows that that's selected. And in this little bar along the bottom, it shows that one end is the red and one end is the black. Okay. And that it is, the type of gradient is radial. You could have linear or you can have radial. Those are the only two kinds of gradients you can have. If I switch to linear, notice that it just goes from left to right, or top to bottom, and diagonal. If I select radial, it goes from the center. Now, something that's popping up here that is pretty interesting, which is, again, unique to Flash, is that the gradient can be edited in any number of ways. If I click under the free transform tool, you'll notice that there's a gradient transform tool. And when I select that, and I click on the object, notice this little bounding box appears. And there's a center point, and there are these little three widgets along, you might call them widgets, I don't know what else to call them. I guess they're little tools, handles to control the gradient. So if I wish to move the gradient from here, the center of it, I can click and drag, and I can reposition it any way I like. That's one way we can change it. We can also change it from a circular or radial gradient to one that's a little bit more elliptical. So if I click here and I move it to the side, Notice how it pulls it left and right. Look like push it in. It makes it narrow and vertical elliptical. Does that make sense when I click and drag left and right? Now, I can also change the scale of the gradient too. With the next one, notice as I click and I drag, very subtle little gradient now. So it changes the scale of it. And the last one allows me to rotate the gradient. It doesn't help me with the radial gradient because if I rotate it in any direction, it looks the same. However, if I select color and I switch from radial to linear gradient, and now I move over the corner and I rotate it, notice that this can go in any direction. It's not restricted to vertical or horizontal. The gradient can go in any direction you choose. Does that make sense? And then when you're done with it, you click off of it and you change it. Yes?
Where's the free transform tool?
The free transform tool is right here. It's the third one down. And hidden underneath that, remember there's a little tick mark in the lower right-hand corner. We have the gradient transform tool. And this is unique to Flash. I don't know of any other program that allows you to edit gradients in this way. You can create your own gradients as well, and they're really not that difficult to do. To do that, go back to the color. If I want to use one of these existing gradients as a base format for my gradient, I can. Really, it makes sense to use one of those in the build plan. And what I can do is if I wish to add another color to this, if I'm happy with the red and the black, I can go ahead and I can click somewhere in the middle. And notice what it does. It adds another little tab below, and it automatically blends and creates a color that's exactly midway between the red and the black. Then what I can do is I can move up to my color palette here, and I can either put in a hexadecimal number, I can either click from the little color picker here, or I can put in RGB colors. Does that make sense? And it adds a color. Right now the three colors are pretty much evenly distributed. But if I want it to be shifted more towards the red, so that there's just a little bit of red and it's predominantly yellow to black, you slide it one way or another. If you want to add another color between these three colors, then again you click, and again you either put in the RGB numbers, you put in a hexadecimal number, or you click to find the color.
Also, if you double click on that, it brings up all the swatches. Double click on one of the little squares.
Right. Then you can, if you want to pick a color from the hexadecimal, web-safe color palette, you can do that as well, yes. And now you have a whole new gradient. But if you want to preserve the gradient, then what you need to do is bring up your swatch palette, and I can move down into the gradient range, and notice that it shows as a fill bucket. And what that's going to do is take the current gradient that I've created, and it adds it to my palette. So you can create as many gradients, or the same is true for color swatches too. If I want to add a color swatch, my own little color swatch here, it will probably lie outside of the web-safe colors, but if I want to create my own custom color, I can do so. So now I'm, moving away from gradients, but by the same token, let me go ahead and switch from the gradient fill to just a solid color. Go back to color, and I can come in here And maybe one of the things that you want to do, and this you'll probably want to do often, because remember, what we're doing at the moment, everything is static. But in a few short days, we'll be able to animate all of this. So what if I want to go from an opaque object to one that's transparent? Well, that can be animated. So the color that I choose for that object to go, maybe that I want to select for it, will also be transparent as well, or partially opaque. That is the alpha that we see here. That's what you can change. So I can make my own custom color that actually includes transparency in there. So if I want this green, but I don't want an opaque green, I want a transparent green, I can come down here and notice that I can adjust this alpha slider. And this shows me that it makes it transparent. At the same time, then I can select swatches and I can click in here. And now it's added this little transparent color. It doesn't look transparent at the moment because it's on a white background. However, if I deselect and I go ahead and I make another color here, let's use a nice blue or something. And I'll make another circle. And I'm going to take this one and bring it to the front of that one. So I'm going to go to Modify, I'm going to go to Arrange, and I'll say bring to front. And now I overlap this. Notice that this is transparent. Now, you can do all of this in other programs, but the reason that they're separating a lot of this is because it can, all of these individual elements, whether it be the opacity, whether it be the gradient, whether it be any number of things, can all be animated independently of one another. Any questions about this? And I actually, in covering gradients, I covered a few other things as well. Alpha, so when I talk about alpha, that has to do with the opacity. We have our swatch palette. We also have our color palette here. Well, I mentioned before I started recording my lecture that we can also save our palettes. We can go ahead go to window, and I want to go to, I can't remember. I thought it was in the swatch. Let's go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry, I was looking in the wrong area. If I have mine, I'm just not looking carefully. If you look in your swatch palette, you can also save colors. And when you save colors, it's going to give you an option. It's going to ask you to, and you want to save them as Flash color set, which is .clr. So this is something that you can open up in any other Flash. You can create your own custom color palette, or color table.act, and this would be the one you would use for Photoshop. So if you create, we could clear all of these colors from this palette and create our own custom palette. And that's done often in companies that either for corporate colors, or it could be that, again, if a team of illustrators and designers are working on a particular project, you're all designing, I don't know, and you're working on an ebook, and everybody's illustrating this book, and you have pages 1 through 5, and you have pages 6 through 10, whatever. And we have the drawings, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to color them, and we've assigned specific colors to each of those characters or parts or whatever. You want to make sure that they're all the same, don't you? So everybody is using the same palette. So that's how we can do it.
You know the color table .act file, is that only limited to Adobe? Is that only limited to Adobe products like Photoshop and Illustrator, or can you do that?
And if you use Illustrator, like there was a whole, color is moved in a whole realm, a whole new realm. I've never seen such a sophisticated piece of color with the new CS3. It's pretty amazing what you can do with color in Illustrator. More than what we're doing way more.
I'm confused. Would you save it under the CIR because you're in Flash? Or do you save it under Photoshop ACT? Well, how would you save your custom color?
You can save it either one, it doesn't matter. In the Flash, you could you can open the ACT as well. You
You
should
can
be
use
able
the
to.
ACT and Flash.
And for just Flash, although, you know what, we may misspoke. It'd probably be safe to say that it's both. So you can always open it in Flash. And then for ACT, those are your Adobe color tables. So that if you do want to transfer your Flash colors to an Adobe program, it does have to be saved as ACT. I know that's what. Let me try that. I'm going to go ahead and I just added this one little color here. So I'm going to save the color table as ACT, and we'll call it. This is table with green. So, and I'm just going to save it on the desktop. Where's my desktop here? So, and now I'm going to go to my color palettes, and what I want to do is I'm going to go back, and I don't want to, I guess I could clear, let me go ahead and clear colors. Oh, so this goes back to black and white. And now I can go ahead and load. I want to add colors, or I want to load colors, or replace colors. So let's go ahead and replace colors. And now it brings up, just like importing an image or opening a file, I can go to my desktop, and you'll see here, here's my table green ACT. I'm going to click open, and it opens. Now it organizes them, which is kind of curious, a little bit different from what we have. The green should be in here somewhere. I don't see it, it has reorganized them. So maybe, let me go back again. I'm going to go ahead and go back to default. I'm going to load default colors. Let me go ahead and create a new color. Well, it isn't a new color, but I've added this. So let's go ahead and save this one too. I'm going to go ahead and save colors. And this one I will save as a CLR file. So this would be second colors. Okay. I'll save it on the desktop as well. Just bad habit that I have. Let's clear the palette again. And let's go back and load my custom colors for replace. You can also add to an existing as well. So here is my second color, CLR, and it keeps that consistent. So yes, I was able to open up the ACT in Flash, but it rearranged all those colors, and I don't understand why it did that and how it did. Yeah, so to maintain a consistent look and organization of my colors, the CLR will work. Because notice it still has that little purple one that I added. Purple color. Okay. So everyone understands alpha. RGB is, if you're not familiar with that, is painting with light, basically. Your three primary colors when you paint with white are red, green, and blue. And so since you're painting with white, if I have, there's a total of 255 possible colors for each one. So if I put in 255 here, and I put in 255 here, what do you think I'm going to get? If you add all of the colors of the rainbow together, what do you get?
White.
White. See, you're thinking there's. On the other hand, the absence of color is black. So if I put 0 in all of these, you get black. And that's gray because remember I have alpha set to 51%. But again, if I go back and I put in 255, including 0 is a total number of 256 possible colors for each one. 255. And then the last one, 255, I have white. Now, I don't have any of these memorized except for black and white. There are color tables, however, where you can put in percentages. And why do you think they have RGB as opposed to CMYK? CMYK is, this is additive color, the other is subtractive. So when you have, what we think of when we paint, when we use, you know, black paint, white paint, primary colors is red, green, the same. Red, yellow, blue. Those are your three primary colors. However, when you add all of those colors together, you get more. So it works exactly in the reverse of painting with light, but pretty darn close. And that's what we're doing because we're designing for the monitor. We're not designing, and that's how color is created on the monitor. It's not the way color is perceived and the way we see it when it's printed on a page. What we see, when we see red when it's with paint on a page, what it's doing is it's absorbing all of the other colors of the color spectrum and it's reflecting red. And mixing of the pigments is a sort of approximation of what we see with water. But think of the colors of the rainbow. That's what I said. All of the colors together make white. And it's when you break those colors down and see them into their different spectrum, in the different spectrum, of the different, I'm not saying this right. Frequencies that you see the rainbows. When you know, it's going through a prism, and the prism happens to be when you see a rainbow, it's water. Water is the refractive index of water is breaking the light up into its different frequencies. And so that's why we see the different colors. And that's what we're doing, we're painting with light. So it's a little bit different when you're trying to create colors using RGB. It's easier just to click on the color picker, white or, you know, if we had a gradient here, again, and selected, suggested you just double click here and pick from one of these 216 common colors. Even though there's 255 possibilities, or 256, including white, remember there's only 216 colors common to both Mac and PC. That's why I'm going back and forth between 216, 256, or 255. Okay, ready to move on to animation? Or does it seem to?
I can't find, how do you get to move to front?
Oh, okay. For example, if I want to bring this object to the front, you go to Modify. Since I want to modify an object, sounds like I know what I'm doing, but I get lost myself because sometimes the way they arrange these is not that logical. And then I want to go to Arrange, and then I select here Bring to Front, which is not the same as Bring to Forward.
Can't do it by doing the object tool, the merge and all that.
If I want, okay, with object-oriented programs, every time you create a brand new object, if I go here, and so we can differentiate these, and I create a brand new one, it's automatically layered on top of the last one I created. So even though I only have one layer, within that layer, the objects are layered on top or below each other. They can't occupy the same space because we're not working with pixels, we're working with objects. So this one now is layered on top of this one, which is layered on top of this one, right? Even though they're on the same layer, these are layered relative to one another on top or below one.
But they're not taking up the whole space. They're not taking up the whole space.
Because if they're defined by mathematics. That's my only explanation. When we work in Photoshop, what you're doing is you see raster or bitmap, and it's, instead of objects, you're working with pixels. It's kind of like needlepoint, where you have each individual little square that you're filling with a color, and so that's how they interleave or overlap one another. What they really do is you're just really painting one pixel at a time. This, you're actually working with objects. This, each of these shapes is a separate object that can be layered, even within a layer, on top or below the other ones. Does it make sense? So, for example, if I want to, what if I want to move this green in between these two? Then I can go to modify, transform, or arrange, and I can say not send to back, but send it back, send it backward. Now it's between those two. Now if I select object send back or send backward once again, if we put it below this one, they can all be arranged. I can also arrange them in layers too. But even within a layer, if I want all of these to be on the same layer, they can't occupy the same space unless, the only way they can occupy the same space is if I break apart each one. And they're no longer, they're still vector, but they're really not occupying the same space. What I've done is I've cut away parts so they're really contiguous, like the states in the United States map. So if I were to break apart each one of these, Command B will break apart, Command B will break apart, Command B will break apart, and I deselect, and now I select these again. See how they're all separate now? So they're not overlapping one another anymore. They're just separate pieces that fit together quite nicely like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's very different. Before they were separate entities overlapping one another. Think of the objects like little pieces of paper and working with a collage. That you can layer and stack them on top of one another, and before you know it, you can create something pretty different looking by covering parts of some shapes up and maybe other parts.
Like it is right now, they're flat, but you see all three of them. You can't, I'm confused as to when you say they can't.
I'm probably not explaining it.
Right,
Go ahead. No, that's okay. Because if you're asking the question, other people are probably thinking the same thing.
You see three, they're flat, it's one layer, but all three will be visible, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so when you're saying is, when they're touching each other, or on top of each other, you only see one flat object, so you only see part of each
You
one.
only see part of it, but they do. But before, when I had them as smart objects or drawing objects, they were independent of one another. And they're still independent of one another. However, when you overlap them, and they interact with one another when they're broken apart. They're still layered on top of one another, though. When I select this one, it's still on top of it. See how it's layered on top?
Yeah, but with the way that's where I'm getting confused. You mean it's the third one you entered or something? When they're laying like that, but when you separate them, you don't see them as one on top of each other, right?
Right, you don't. When they're separate, you're correct. You do not see them layered. They appear flat and two-dimensional. But in fact, when you want them to interact with one another, they're not. They are layered on top of one another. Yeah. Other questions? They're good questions. So, sort of clear, most of this? Okay.
When it is not a smart object, they're flat and I cannot move one back and one forward. I cannot do that, yes.
They are layered on top of one another, but remember that when they are overlapped and you deselect them, then the top one functions as a cookie cutter and cuts away from the bottom one, or if they're the same color, then they unite. So they're still layered on top of one another, but then you've also reconfigured the shapes.
But then I cannot, like, if I have a combination of the smart object and one that is not, I cannot bring that it's not to the front.
You can. So if I take, let's take this one. I want to bring this one to the front.
But that's a
And,
smart, that's
right,
a smart.
let's go ahead and select that one and say Command V for breakable. It's selected, and I'll go to Modify, Transform, and I'll say, not Transform. Oh, wait, it's not going to allow me to arrange it. Modify. Can't arrange it. Maybe it won't. I misspoke. We'll take this one now and go Modify, Arrange, and we'll say send back. It won't. Right. You know what? I misspoke. It does really change it dramatically when you have shape objects. I assume that I couldn't arrange them, and you can't. It stays put where it is. So you would want to take this one and turn it into a group, probably, because it's not a smart object now. And a group will behave like a smart object. And remember the key command for group? Command G, G for group. And notice by doing that, it automatically brought it to the front. And now I can rearrange it.
So when you did that, are all three approved or just?
No, just this one.
That's the only one that's approved.
And what this is doing, it's grouping the fill with the stroke. And for anybody who has worked in Illustrator, it's a hard concept, at least for me to fathom. It was initially, because they behave sometimes as a single unit, and other times they behave separately. But the fill and the stroke are separate entities. So by grouping them, I have grouped them together now. And that's really what a smart object is, or a drawing object, is it is by default kind of grouped the fill and the stroke together, so they behave as one. But remember, when you double click on it, they can be separated again. Or if you hit Command V, then it breaks them apart into their separate entities again.
The fill and the stroke.
So you don't have to have,
If you lose the stroke, how do you get the stroke back? If you're missing pieces of the stroke?
oh, so if I select this and I double click in here, remember, so I'm inside it,
Yeah.
and I double click on the stroke, and I delete it, and I go, oh shoot. And then I go back out here and go, what happened? I lost the stroke. We can always go back into the object by double clicking on it, so I'm inside the drawing object. I can use the inkwell or ink bottle, and I can select any color that I want. If I want to make a red fill, and I move over the edge, and I click, and it fills it. And then I also can change. You go ahead and select it now, and make sure that it's selected. I can also change the width of it too. I mean, you can make a stroke look almost like a fill. It's all relative.
How do you lose part of the stroke? Because I did that. I was losing little pieces of it.
Yeah, that has to do with anchor points, and it depends on. For example, the square is an easier one to do a rectangle. But if I make a rectangle, like so, and let me go ahead and select the stroke and make it a little bigger so you can see what's going on here. And now when I click on one side, notice how each one is separate from the other. If I can take this and move it apart, and take this and move it apart, it gets, if I just move over it and do it, it bends it, select it, and move it apart. Now, here's another one for you. Select that one, and select, whoops, select this one, and move them on top of one another, and deselect. And now when I select them, now I have 4 pieces.
So they're all separate objects.
Yeah, and to know or to, try to imagine when they're going to cut apart like this and when they're not. Because you would think because they're all the same color, they would unite as one. But when they intersect that way, they don't. They break apart as separate objects. You have to remember when you do that. If I want to select them all, you go to click, and that selects them. Or just pay close attention when you're selecting one. Notice only part of the select, and the others are independent. This is unique to Flash, and I think it is very confusing for a lot of people. It has been for many years. Okey-dokey. Ready to move on to animation. So now we're going to move these elements. Move them from point A to point B. Just simple movement. We'll start with frame-by-frame animation, the same way that traditional animators worked for many, many years. One frame at a time. And later on, then we'll move into cleans, where you create minimum of 2 keyframes, one at one point, one at the end, and then the Flash will generate all of the in-between frames. Okay, so it moves a little bit more slowly from the point to. We'll go ahead and erase all of this. Where's my eraser here? Let's go back. And then erase all. Okay, so now it's time to look at the timeline. And this is really, really important. Now I want to focus. You see that we have by default a single layer. And we can rename the layer. I'll name it in this particular case red ball. So I'm going to make a red ball in there. And we can control the visibility of it by turning on and off the eye icon. We can lock this particular layer, and we can view the layer as an outline. What I want to focus on is the timeline and the frame rate. Start by looking at the frame rate. Frame rate, by default, when you open up the program, should be 12 frames per second. And that is noted here. When I use the selection tool, and I click on the background, remember when we look at our properties panel, it tells me the frame rate here, too. There's also a third place that I can go find the frame rate. I can go to Modify Document for Command J. Don't crash, please. It tells me the frame rate here, too. Frame rate, 12 frames per second. Minimum 12 frames per second, maximum 25 frames per second. The fewer frames per second you use, the more skittish the animation will be. You'll have kind of a staccato effect. 20 frames per second approximates, at least on the web, pretty close to 24 frames per second, which is what film is. In film, it's pretty much what we see. Any more, any less, we blend those frames together and it looks continuous. Does that make sense? And why it's at 24? I think somebody told me, but I don't remember. That's what it is. If you're designing for video, United States video is 30 frames per second, but it really doesn't pay to design it for 30 frames per second, unless you know it's going directly to video. For European video, PAL is 25 frames per second. In this class, most of the time we will use 20 frames per second. And any
How much was the maximum that you said for us? 25?
25. And again, when you publish your file, the computer will try to play it at that frame rate. It doesn't guarantee it. It depends on the end user's computer and how, fast processor that your computer has. If it can keep up with that frame rate, it will play it. If it's an old computer or a slow computer and it can't, then it will try to keep at that frame rate, but then you'll start to see dropped frames, and then it will have that herky-jerky staccato effect when it moves across the stage. And it will even do that here at 20 frames per second sometimes when we preview it. Okay? So I'll put in 20, and normally when you're at home, you can click on this little button in the lower left-hand corner, and it will say make default. So anytime you create a new project from there on out, it will automatically be 20 frames per second. That does not work here because we have deep freeze installed. And remember, it resets the computer to a default setting that's been, put in here by the people in computer services. But at home, so you don't have to remember to keep going back and changing the frame rate. That's what I would do every time you create a new project. And then if you deviate from that for some reason, if you want to drop it to 12 frames per second, then you can change it. But it's fine. You can only have one frame rate per project. You can only have one background color in a project. You can't have multiple background colors, multiple frame rates. Now, while I have said that, you can do that if you know how to program it. But just by using the default settings, you can. So I'll change the 20, we'll give it a title, and this will be, the name animation.
How do you get to that window?
Command J for modify document. Now remember, I can change the frame rate here, highlight it, we can change it back to 12. But what I would not do is jump back and forth in a project, because if you have taken the time to animate several objects and get the timing just right, and then later on in a project think, well, this timing isn't right, I'll change the frame rate. Remember, it changes everything else that you've already done, and you can really move things up. And it can be corrected, but it will many times it will be easier just to start over, which is sad, and you lose a lot of time. Yes, right.
How do you get that dialog box?
This properties? This is just the properties panel, window, properties.
It looks different than mine.
Mine too.
It doesn't have that information.
This looks different?
Yeah.
Does it show filters? Or does it look parameters?
Well, it has all three, but
click on properties then.
Some properties, but it has the information.
Well, it probably will look different because this is sensitive to whatever is selected. Notice that if I select the tool, that's what it looks like. If I click on the background,
Okay.
then that's what this will look like. That's why the properties panel is so important. It adds functionality to just about everything you select. Whatever is selected, it will customize the properties to that particular tool or background or type or whatever it is that's selected. It will change according to what is selected. It also gives me my stage size here. I can go to publish settings from here. You can do a lot of stuff by just clicking on the background. Here, it's pretty nice. So your properties panel should be up at all times because it gives lots of useful information. In the timeline, you can see that it starts with frame 1, and you can have as many frames as you want. It goes almost to infinity. We're going to try to minimize the number of frames that we use. And you'll see later on by using symbols and that sort of thing that we don't have to use a whole bunch of frames. And it labels them at the top in 1, 5, 10, 15, 20, and it's just to mark them so that it's easier to read. And if by using 20 frames per second, it's easier to if you're thinking in terms of seconds, if I want a little animation that's 3 seconds alone, 3 times 20 is 60. That's easier than saying 3 times 12 is 36. And you go, okay, that I know what 36 is, but then I have to go 35, oh, 36. It just takes a little bit more time every time you do that to find that on the timeline. And every 5th frame is grayed. That's all that indicates. It's easier to find, to go to place in time. Notice that by default we have a movie when we create a blank document that is 1 frame long. So we can just have one static project. It doesn't have to be animated. Along the top we're able to use a little slider here to scrub back and forth. But notice, and this is what drove me nuts early on with Flash, is that if you only have a 1 frame animation, you can't click and scrub and drag and move the playhead. That's what this is. If you've ever played with an old analog video or something, you can scrub back and forth, sound and video. Has anyone ever played with that? No. Okay, then it won't matter to anyone. But you can scrub back and forth. And when we have a longer animation, you'll see that you can take the playhead and you can scrub back and forth to get an idea of how the animation is going to move. It's similar in traditional animation when animators, I don't know how to do this. They would typically work on 5 cells at a time, or 5 keyframes at a time. Or the tweeners would work on 5 cells at a time, and they could fold between their fingers these 5 different slips of paper and flip through them so that they can get a sense of how smooth the motion is. Because each cell is a different part of the animation, and in the end you want everything to read nice and smooth. So imagine those guys, 24 frames per second, and they're doing little cartoons. For every second you have 24 drawings. That's a lot. It's changed a lot though with computers, because now it creates the tweens automatically. So the guys at the top of the food chain are the ones that do the keyframes. So let's talk about all these frames. Right now we have a movie that's 1 frame long, and I can tell it's 1 frame long because I can see that this is highlighted, the first frame, and it has a little white dot in the base here. This is called a blank keyframe. Blank keyframes are placeholders. That's it. It holds a place in time. Now, as soon as I'm going to set, I was going to make a little red ball here, so let's switch to my oval tool. And I want this to be one gradient tool. I'll just say no stroke. Click it so. And we'll just get crazy about this. I'm going to make it look more like that. Notice what happened to the keyframe as soon as I put an object on the stage. It's no longer a blank keyframe, it is a keyframe. A keyframe has something on the stage at that point in time. The little dot turned black. Now, on frame 2, if I want the ball to disappear, poof, magically go away, what I can do is that I can insert another blank keyframe. So that's a placeholder in time, but there will be nothing on stage. Does that make sense? Okay, so I will now click on frame 2, and I will insert timeline blank keyframe. Poof, it disappeared. So notice, now I can scrub back and forth. Now I have a movie that's 2 frames long. on frame 1, I have a populated frame, keyframe with the red ball. Frame 2, I have what is called a blank keyframe, which is just a placeholder in time. Now, if you want to know what this animation looks like, we can go to, make sure that it's saved, make sure I'll save it on the desktop. To preview it, I can either hit the return key, and it just goes through once, the playhead once, or I can go to Control and select Test Movie. You can also use Command Return to do that. And by doing that, it publishes it and makes it visible for you, so you can see, get a preview of what this is going to look like when you publish it as what file format? What's the extension? The one that I would use for the web? SWF.
What is the command? What?
Command return, if you want to do that. Otherwise, just go. This is what it looks like. So you have this little flashing ball. It's playing 20 frames per second. And it's, by default, flash animations loop. It doesn't play through and stop. It automatically goes from frame 1 to frame 2, and then it goes back to frame 1 in a loop. It automatically does that. And later on, when we get to a point, we'll add a little bit of action script, not much, just a teeny tiny bit. We will add to the frame and put a stop action, so that if you want it to play once, it will play once and stop. And then when we add interactivity to it, what we can do is we can add buttons that tell it where to go on the playhead. That we can tell it to stop, we can tell it to play, we can tell it to go to a particular frame. So if this is all you wanted, was a little flashing ball, you don't have to have a lengthy animation. You only need 2 frames, because in Flash it's automatically going to loop. It's going to just need 2 frames, and that's it. Okay? Now, what if I wanted this to be here for 5 frames, or maybe even, well, 1 second, so that would be 20 frames. And then I want it to disappear and just hold it, and that's it for a long time. Okay, what I can do is I can add frames to this. They are not keyframes, it just denotes that right now the ball is on the stage for 1/20th of a second, approximately. So what I can do now is I can go to Insert, Timeline, Frame, or F5, and look what it did. You see how you see a little square here? If I keep hitting F5, watch what happens. It's just extending the life of this object on the stage. It's going to remain put here, same place, it's not changing, for a total of 19 frames. And then on frame 20, it disappears. Now watch what happens when I go to Control, Test Movie, or you hit Command, Return. Considerably different. Every time this blinks, what it's doing is it's going through this blank keyframe for 1/20th of a second and then jumping back to frame 1. And then it plays for 19 frames. That's why it seems more static. Now, on the other hand, what if I wanted to extend the life of the blank keyframe? Do the same thing, hit F5, and it extends the life of that. So now watch what happens. So this now exists for half a second. So now when I go to Test Movie again, it's there. Now it disappears for a half a second, and then it loops back again to frame 1, And it holds in place for 19 seconds and then it disappears for a half a second. Yes.
How can you repeat like the same keyframe, like copy and paste?
Copy and paste.
Is there a way?
You can. It's easier. Well, we'll get to that. Because we're going to copy and paste and we're going to invert frames and all sorts of stuff.
Get on set.
So what's the difference between adding a frame and adding a keyframe?
Okay, a keyframe denotes that something is changing on the stage. When this sits here, nothing is changing. So you just need to add frames. These are unpopulated frames. These are just simply, populated frames. This is a blank keyframe. This is a keyframe. Blank keyframe means that there's nothing on the stage. If I go here, and as soon as I go here and I add something, it changes all of this. So now when I play this, watch what happens. That blank, that emptiness or that flashing went away.
How do you make it play?
Huh?
How do you make it play?
Command, return, or go to Control, Test Movie. See what happens when I added something here? It was no longer a blank keyframe. It was no longer a placeholder. I changed something. In a way, I moved that ball from here to here. So I'm going to go back. You go ahead. Sorry. Timeline.
Did you delete one keyframe?
Don't worry about it. Because it's going to get confusing. I'm doing things that I probably shouldn't be doing. Skip back over.
So keyframe is sort of like
Okay. Well, we're going to animate. If I was standing here, sitting here as I am, and I wanted to animate my arm going back and forth, right? It only changes in two places. It's here and here. So you need two keyframes, one here and one here. And then any part in between that are considered tweens. It's a term that was used by animators to create all the in-betweens. So there were actually people who were called tweeners. There were people who weren't as high in the ranks as the animators, and when they started, they were the ones, after they were handed the keyframes, they were the ones who would generate all the in-between frames.
We don't have to do that. All you have to
It depends on what style we're going for. We're going to start with frame-by-frame animation. That's what we're going to do now. And then eventually we will move to tween if you want to automate it. It really depends on the look we're going for. Now I'm going to clear all of this. So I click and drag to select it all. If I click and drag, it's one fell swoop. If I click and release the mouse and then I drag, it actually moves, and notice it added another blank keyframe. So it's a one fell swoop if you want to select all these frames. It's click and drag and then they're highlighted. Then I can go to edit and I can go to timeline and I can select cut frames. Now I have to, again, click and drag, and I want to edit, timeline, remove frames, and boom, I'm back to where I started.
You have to clear it first and then cut it?
You have to highlight the frames that you want to remove.
First you did clear.
Right, because I cleared, well, I may have moved.
Just
Let me
did
go,
cut?
let me go back again.
And so right now,
So let me highlight it, click and drag, all but the first frame. Now let's go to edit, timeline. I'm just going to say renew frames.
Yeah.
Now, one of the, in the book, we start to do the exercises in the book, inserting and deleting the frames sometimes is not so easy. I'm going to deviate from the book, and I hope that this will help you. Because it's saying, you know, exercise 2 is creating frame-by-frame animation with keyframes. And it's pretty much the same. Okay, we'll do that. So what I'm going to do, and we'll do the same one that we have in the book here. I'm going to use the brush tool, and we're going to create the word export. Okay? And it's going to be frame by frame, traditional animation. And we'll start by with an empty timeline, except for this blank keyframe. And I'm going to start with my brush with black. I'm just going to create half of my X. Oh, shoot. I want black. So just an X, half of an X. Notice that it's now a keyframe, correct? Now I want to create the other half of my X, but I want, as I'm doing this, I want all of this to be animated. So this is my first step, or my first frame. Now what I'll do is I'll click frame 2, and I will say insert timeline keyframe. Now watch what happens. Before I inserted blank keyframe, didn't I? And when I toggle back and forth, it looks like nothing changes, doesn't it? When you insert a keyframe as opposed to a blank keyframe, what it does is it goes back on the timeline